Our next speaker is Malcolm Rose. Many of us have known him for quite a few years. Malcolm comes from England, and he's a wonderful example of a scholar, scientist, technician, and builder all wrapped into one. Those of you in the early keyboard world know about rose wire, and you're about to meet the person who is responsible for rose wire, Malcolm Rose.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you've all had a good strong coffee, because this is one of these complicated stories. This must be one of the world's most decorated harpsichords. Not always a good idea. I always think the art of decoration is knowing quite when to stop. Anyway, here is the 1623 in its present home, the Cobbe Collection Trust at Hatchlands Park near Guildford in Surrey, National Trust House. It's called the 1623 only because of the date on the soundboard, and I'm sure you will have guessed that the harpsichord does not date from 1623, which is why there's a lot of mystery attached to it, and that's why I'm talking about it. Does this move us on? Yep. No, yep. Here it is at the Palais Lascaré in Nice, when it was part of the Michael Thomas collection. More on him in a moment. The Palais Lascaré is now reopened, in fact, as a museum. I think its musical instrument holdings are only second to the Cité de la Musique in France. The 1623 had been at an ancient house called Cobbe Court in Somerset for generations, perhaps since new, as I will show you later on. The house belonged to the Hellier family from medieval times right through to the end of the 19th century. And here it is, down the bottom right, in the Great Hall of Cobbe Court. This photograph dates from around 1950. And the son, Simon Heneage, of the last surviving Hellier, remembers the jacks and keys and things being taken as kindling wood in his early lifetime, so I suppose in the 20s and 30s. Here it is in the Sotheby's catalogue. It was sold in 1972 and bought by the player, collector, and dealer Michael Thomas. The catalogue description, as usual, does not tell us anything much of interest. Note, though, that the instrument really looks quite flat in this photo, whereas it now suffers from the usual English twist. I have my suspicions that most happened in Michael Thomas's ownership, in hot cars and things like that. Soon after the sale at Sotheby's, a red-hot exchange of letters erupted in the English Harpsichord magazine of blessed memory, between Michael Thomas insisting that the date was genuine and John Barnes, curator of the Russell collection, who was quite sure that it was not, and this all added to the mystery. Eventually, Michael Thomas sold it to Andreas Beuermann, the collector in Germany, who later sold it to Alec Cobbe. Here's the date by which it's known. Excuse the dust which it had at this stage. Both the date and this unusual intricate border pattern were created with bole, which is a mixture of fine red clay and glue. So it's actually quite raised, a little bit like chinoiserie technique. When the pattern's completed, the bole is dampened slightly and gold leaf applied to it. And throughout you see little traces of the red bole underneath. This is the border pattern around the rose, and the bevel is also gilded. There has not been actual metal or parchment rose present since the instrument emerged in modern times. The restorer Chris Nobbs first suggested that the border pattern is older than the current floral decoration on the soundboard, and that the main soundboard decoration has been scraped away, leaving the border and the date. Here you can see that someone has most likely put a piece of wood along beside the bridge, slid a chisel down it, and then scraped away from the border. There are many places where he slipped, and the edge is pretty wobbly. Over most of the soundboard, I think you can see there, the hard grains stand up from the soft. No, the other way around, the soft grains stand up from the hard. indicating that quite some pressure has been applied. The question is, when and why would a whole decorative scheme have been removed? There are two instruments which, together with the 1623, form a trio of harpsichords which are not what they appear to be. This is one of them, always known as the Ham House Rookers, which John Barnes showed in the 1970s had no connection with the Rookers family, although the name Andreas Rookers appears on it prominently. My thanks to the National Trust for this photo. And this is the other, an instrument at Helmingham Hall in Suffolk in England. This has long been dismissed as a fake, if such things were ever intended to be fakes, which is another question. But recently, Chris Nobbs has shown that it reuses several genuine Rookers parts, including the soundboard and the spine. Photo thanks to Chris Nobbs for this one. The three instruments are linked by several features. For example, they all have this curious shelf. I think I'll get a dot. This is the ham house. It's upside down. So here's the lower belly rail or lower header. There's the treble corner, treble side just starting. And on the top of the lower belly rail, this enormous shelf extends out, enough to keep a year's supply of jam and honey on it if there was room underneath. And then these blocks were put in between the lower braces and the bottom of the shelf. And then the upper braces come through, if they happen to cross this area, they come through and are glued onto this shelf. There are all the spacer blocks on the top of the shelf, and the 1623 is more or less identical in construction to this. This is the Ham House harpsichord again, a general view of the bracing. This is after John Barnes removed an awful lot of Dolmetsch work done in the 1890s. Dolmetsch strikes again. One curious feature are these two large screw holes in the oak 4-foot hitchpin rail of the Ham House, which John Barnes has pointed out with arrows there, and there. And here are very similar ones in the 1623, almost in the same place. Any suggestion as to what they were for is welcome afterwards. Something to do with making it, something to do with gluing it on, something to do with gluing the soundboard in, possibly. They're enormous, about number 12 screws if you have the same system as we do. But these holes and the shelf construction does make it possible that these three instruments are from the same hand, or at least the same workshop. The Helmingham Hall one also has that shelf. And here is the 1623 again with a close-up of one of these holes, marked with a pencil, presumably before drilling. At some stage, someone has chiseled away about a third of the width of this 4-foot hitchpin rail. You can see the marks to the left of it at the moment. And this is why the bottom has so many openings like a Swiss cheese we've just seen. The interesting point about this, I think, is that at some stage someone was critical of the instrument and thought it would be a way of improving it. Then the keyframes of the 1623 offer more connections with other harpsichords, not necessarily this group of three. Keyframes are original, but the keys are not. The keys are by Michael Thomas. This is the treble of the upper manual, just one great big slab of oak. This is how Rookers did it, of course, as well. And this is the treble end of the harpsichord, upper manual of the harpsichord by John Wilbrook of 1730, which is in the Mirrie collection, now alongside the Russell collection in Edinburgh. Again, it's just a slab, though this time it's from softwood. Note that the balance pins are in one line, naturals and sharps, they're not staggered. This is one I worked on a long time ago. This is the original hitchpin rail, balance rail overlay, which was too weak to use in places. So I glued it here and put a new one in the place of the original. You can certainly see it's all in one straight line. And here is the bolt which fixes the upper manual of the 1623 into position. And here is the equivalent, sorry, it's slightly out of focus, the equivalent in the Wilbrook. Almost the same, and the one in the base, better photograph. And the treble end of the lower manual in keyframe in the 1623, and you'll see that the original balance pin positions now plugged are also in a single line. And the lower manual in the Wilbrook, again, originally in a single line, but that one has been reworked at some stage. More on that group of makers later. Because all the balance pins were in single lines, of course, it's difficult to work out the original compass and disposition. In fact, that has been one of the big mysteries. The present compass is 60 notes, F to F, without the bottom F sharp. But this is from Michael Thomas's reworking, putting new keys on the original keyframes. There are more than 60 pins in each set of bridge, nut, and tuning pin holes, so every possibility of confusion. One lead into solving the puzzle was the spacing of the first 3 balance pin holes. They're placed slightly forward, no idea why, and there, and there, and then going on along there. And again, in the upper manual, the same sort of spacing, although the very, very first one is a tiny bit further right than you might expect to be evenly spaced. They are too far apart to make semitones, as it were. To cut a long story short, it gradually became clear that the original compass was D, E, F, and then chromatic to F3, 63 notes. And this theory does actually bring in every other little thing that you notice, how the rear guide has been shortened, this has been shortened, that's been moved, and so on. It does, thank goodness, fit all the evidence, which is fairly unusual in these cases. Here are two original surviving lower manual keys which remain with the instrument, and they look immediately very much like an F and an F sharp, also look very English. And if my theory is right, the numbering on the keys is correct, 3 and 4. So D, E, and then F is number 3. It's very early, I think, for stamped numbers. Maybe somebody has other examples, but then we don't know the date yet. The balance pin holes on these 2 keys are, in fact, side by side in a single line, not staggered, so that helps to confirm that they are original. And they have no signs of having had couplers, therefore the instrument had a dogleg setup. There's no alternative. So I believe that this was the first stage, that 63-note compass. 4 foot must be original, dogleg, and working out the string band position from all the evidence, it would all have been a semitone higher than now. A short scale, which of course makes you wonder about the pitch. It could be choir pitch at that sort of length, about 466, which is a pitch that seems to come right through into the early 20th century. I also believe that the instrument was not originally planned to have 63 notes. Otherwise, there would not have been 3 hitch pins landing up along the short side here, and the bridges have certainly been shortened. It's really quite a mess around here. It's not such a mess now. I'm just working on the instrument. Have been for nearly 4 years, but not full-time. The key blocks would have been narrow with this compass too, about 11 millimeters, just under half an inch each side, which is fairly, well, unusual, not impossible. So I think this compass was crammed in to a pre-existing case. And just while we're looking at that treble corner, here's the treble corner of the Ham House one. You see similar sort of layout, but not nearly so tight for space. And in the original setup, the registers would presumably have looked like this. This is the Wilbrook harpsichord again. The back one is the 4-foot plucking left. The middle one is the 8-foot plucking right, and the dog-legged 8-foot in the front plucking left, where the dog leg has to be in the front, of course. This is English setup, English facing. The Wilbrook with the one that has very, very similar keyframes, and all the Wilbrook action is original. Now, the present rest plank of the 1623 is not original. It's replaced in order to build in a lute stop. Here is the mortise in the treble side, which the later rest plank did not engage. So originally, the rest plank went nicely and deeply into this big slot, and the later rest plank did not. Later rest plank cannot be original for various reasons. And the mortise in the base from that. The mortise goes right through the spine. It's an intriguing thought that it would have been possible to pass the rest plank right through the spine when gluing it in, if the nuts were not on it at the time. And then there's a thin, sort of 5/16 of an inch reinforcing plate that you see through the mortise, this one, which runs right along to beyond the gap here. Rather English feature that it was doubled up, so it sort of closed up afterwards. Now this mounting block, this big thing, this dates from the time of the new rest plank. The original rest plank, being so well mortised in, didn't need much down there. I think the sort of reinforcing plate it had is in behind this. And I think on the next one, you can just at the edge there see there's a gap down here, and the original reinforcing plate is in behind there. All a bit sort of rough and ready. This is when the second rest plank was just falling out. You see big gaps and so on. Didn't take long to get it out. The fact that the gilding inside extends in behind these new mounting blocks makes me to think that the gilding is older than the new rest plank, and therefore possibly original. You can see up here, the inside is gessoed first, and then gold leaf on the gesso, not with the red ground that you usually see in gold leaf, so it's a rather lemony colour gold. And the gesso also was in behind the new rest plank there, and some of it and some gold stuck to that front edge of the new rest plank. Now the lower keyframe had to be cut out around those new mounting blocks. And since the keyboards were such a tight fit in the case, there was no room for the top and bottom notes. Therefore, I propose stage 2, the rest plank replaced, new support blocks, everything cut out round them, and now presumably E to E. Not impossible to shift the whole set of keys up and down, I suppose, because the balance pins are in a straight line, but it never really looks convincing. I think it's all slightly wobbly. I doubt it. It must have been E to E. And the new lute, the layout then would have been like the Wilbrook, same as before for the main registers, and then the lute has to pluck left the same as the dogleg. That's the Wilbrook again. And that's the end of the lute register in the Wilbrook. Nice, neat work. Work on the social background to this instrument is being undertaken by Maria Boxall and is very much an ongoing project. You probably know her name from her work on fingering, historical fingering technique. The ownership of Coker Court, as I mentioned, was for several centuries in the hands of this Hellyer family, and it was a family tradition that one Mary Goddard brought the harpsichord with her on her marriage to the fourth William Hellyer in 1717. And if this is true, and there's no real reason to doubt it at the moment, the harpsichord must date from before this date. So here are some dates to sort of pin us down: her birth, her marriage, died in 1750, and then mention of some tuning dates. Helps to confirm that the instrument was always there, but of course they never specify the instrument. It could be something else, and the habit of calling everything a spinet doesn't help either. Now, it seems that Mary Goddard laid claim to a coat of arms which, strictly speaking, belonged to the rather grander Goddards up in Wiltshire. So one possibility is that she had had her arms included on the soundboard in the original decoration. And perhaps it was her son, who she didn't get on with, son William, who had that first decoration scraped off, simply because her claim to the arms was very questionable. At least the external decoration seems to be original. We don't know what influence Mary Goddard herself had on it, but it does match other furniture described in an inventory of 1723. For example, a bureau in a rare European-style polychrome floral decoration on a black japanned ground. The three panels, you see on another photo in a minute, three panels are scenes from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And the Hellyer family's ownership of sugar plantations in Jamaica, granted to them by Charles II, may have be reflected in the presence of the parrots on both the inside and outside of the case. So who should the police be interviewing in connection with this instrument? The keyframes had that sort of instant familiarity to me from working on the Wilbrook harpsichord. And I saw the very similar harpsichord by Hermann Tarbell of 1721 back in those days, also almost identical. And this connection leads me to this group. Thanks to Maria Boxall's work, we now know that Tarbell was German, not from the Netherlands, as has long been thought, though he was in Amsterdam for a number of years, where he left a very large unpaid bill for gin. And, I think, a wife. Schudy and Kirkman, of course, are familiar names. And we now also know that Wilbrook was also German and also from the Hanover region. So Johann Wilbrock, I suppose, originally. He signed himself in the one harpsichord Tarbell's Man, and there's one spinet surviving by him. I'm not suggesting that any one of these four necessarily made this group of three instruments, but there's some connection here. Perhaps someone so far unknown to us who worked in the same workshop and took various trade practices away with him. Perhaps he was fired. A lot of it is not terribly well made, I must say. There's much still to be done on the maker, on the domestic background, on coats of arms and parrots and sugar, and various stages of its decoration and redecoration. I think at least we now know the original compass and disposition, but this just leads to two big questions. What were Mary Goddard's musical reasons for wanting it to start on D, if that was her choice? In other words, what would players be doing with such deep notes in early Georgian England? And secondly, what was the mindset behind creating such instruments? Were they meant to deceive, as I think a lot of the French makers were meaning, or were they regarded in the same way as we now regard copies? I hope that Maria Boxall and I will be able to offer a joint article for publication on this in due course. That's it. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions.
John Goldbrook and Herman Willenbrock, who was in Hanover in about 1710.
I don't think so, although now that we know that Wilbrook was German, maybe this opens the question up again. I was looking at the Willenbrock. This is remains of a claviorgan in the Met. And it's curiously written. The name is inlaid in the jackrail, I think, isn't it? In tiny, tiny pieces of brass tubing, each one drilled and inlaid. And he says Willen and then a capital B, Brock. Now, is this his fancy? Is it a double name? Did they have double names in those days? Or was that Willen his middle name? So as far as I know, there's no connection at the moment, but maybe we need to think again. That's the sort of thing that Maria Boxall is incredibly good at. I will point her at it.
I'm not sure, I couldn't quite hear some of what you were saying. Did you speak about the original compass, and is that compass known from other instruments? Does it make sense?
I think there is mention, well, there's certainly a German harpsichord from not much later. One of the Graebners is D to D. And Maria has found various mention of people playing transcriptions from the opera, and this is early and mid Handel's life. And I think it's clear that people were enjoying playing keyboard transcriptions from the opera, where I suppose you can splash around in octaves. Mainly, perhaps that was the main justification of going down to D. But of course, we don't know whether this was Maria's personal choice or not, but I think so. Otherwise, there is no reason for her to find a ready-made case and say, yes, I'll have that, but I wanted to extend the compass. And I'm sure that case was not made to have those two extra naturals down there. It must have been awfully tight. It's awfully tight in the treble. At the moment, I'm just doing on the voicing at the moment, the treble has problems, shall we say. I'm hoping for a miracle to occur. In other words, it's awful. It's got an awfully big bridge sitting on a very big 4-foot hitchpin rail. I don't think it's ever going to be, it's going to set the world on fire.
One more quick question. If it's not a quick one, don't ask it. Okay, I have a quick one. On a second stage of the instrument that you showed, the wires in the base were very heavy. Was that just the photography, or were they actually using wire that thick?
Any strings that have been on recently were from Michael Thomas's time.
Okay.
Yes. No, it wasn't unreasonable. There's probably 0.6 brass at the bottom. No, it was nothing crazy. I think it's just the photography and the lighting.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Okay.